So hi, my name's Joe Brewer and I'm a change strategist. I do these videos to offer book reviews on topics that may be of interest to people that want to bring about large-scale social change in the world. And the topic that I want to explore today is the topic of the neuroscience of consciousness. And this is something that comes up regularly in discussions about utopian technological futures. It arises oftentimes in discussions about consciousness and spirituality, and there seems to be a bit of a misunderstanding about how rich the history is looking at the science of consciousness. And so there's one book in particular that I think is really useful as a guidepost for this whole discourse, and that is this one, The Feeling of What Happens by Antonio Damasio, and the subtitle is Body and Emotion in the Making of Consciousness. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the work of Antonio Damasio, he and his research team have, for decades now, been doing research on people who have either serious head trauma that causes damage to their brain or diseases that deteriorate the functioning of the brain. And they look at the regions that are impacted, and then they observe the loss or augmentation of emotions, of reasoning abilities, of perception, and of consciousness. And so over several decades of looking at all of these examples of real-world cases where someone was maybe in a car accident, had damage to part of their brain from a head injury, and then they lost the ability to manage their social relationships and perceive risk appropriately. These sorts of real-world situations, they've built up a very sophisticated understanding of human reasoning and the role of emotions, and in particular, how people's awareness comes to being in a physiological way. So the basic argument or thesis offered in The Feeling of What Happens is that human consciousness arises through a series of layers of emergent capabilities in the human body. So let me unpack that a little bit for you. First of all, the foundational piece to this is that the mind arises from body functioning, and so there's a profound interplay between the mind itself and the brain and the body and its embeddedness in social and physical contexts. This is what cognitive scientists call the theory of embodiment, and it is the most robust and widely accepted understanding of the human mind coming out of the cognitive sciences. So we start with that, and then we ask the question, what is consciousness and how could it arise through the body or be consistent with what we know about how the body works? And Damasio takes a very interesting approach to this by observing something that every multicellular organism is able to do, and actually single-cellular organisms are able to do it too, which is to achieve the state of homeostasis. Now, homeostasis is a living organism's ability to keep key internal parameters within some operating range. So think of your body temperature, how if your temperature falls below about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, that you'll go into a serious hypothermia and your body will begin to break down and the functioning stops working. And if on the other side, if your temperature gets above, say, 104, 105 degrees, you can have serious damage to your brain, and it can dramatically reduce your body's functioning. So there's this operating range that the body needs to stay within. It turns out that a key mechanism or function that the body is able to do to achieve this homeostasis is to create neurological maps of the state of the body as it's monitoring these different parameters from one moment to the next. So your body might be monitoring its internal temperature, it might be monitoring molecules that are released associated to stress or physical damage to a part of the body, and then the body is able to respond to this because in our complex multicellular form, our brain is able to track the state of the body as a collective gestalt from one moment to the next. Now, it turns out that this ability to have homeostasis requires the body to have a very rudimentary form of self-awareness. And so this is a foundation for a very simple form or a very crude form of consciousness. Now, when we start to take this and build it upward into the way that the brain works, And first of all, let me just clarify that the nervous system is not just the brain. The nervous system involves all of the nerves spread throughout the body. So think of your spinal cord, the sense receptors in your fingers and toes, and so on. But also it involves chemical signaling in the glands across your body, what's called the lymphatic system, and in your circulatory system that is distributing all of the chemicals that are moving around in your body as it's augmenting the way that the electrical circuitry of your neurons are firing. All of this interplay, all these pieces are part of what we call the nervous system. And so when we talk about this awareness in the body, we're talking about a very complex set of interactions. Now, when we look at the way that the nervous system achieves higher levels of consciousness, for example, the ability to have a conscious awareness of what one is doing as it's moving about in the world. So let's say that I'm using my visual perception system to see a change in my environment and respond accordingly. That this level of intelligent response requires a central nervous system and a brain that is able to synthesize all of the information that the body is using to monitor itself from one moment to the next, and then combine it into meaningful structures of processed information. And all of this leads to a higher level form of consciousness. Now, when Damasio is building up this theory of consciousness through the workings of the body and through the workings of the brain, a very important piece of what he's doing that I think is incredibly important is he's taking this body's monitoring system for homeostasis and showing how systematic biases can be introduced that direct the processing of information toward goals. And this is very important because if that was not happening, then it'd be very difficult for us to say that the brain and the body can come to attention and focus on some things and not others. And so he develops this understanding from many years of research by his team and by others that emotions and body states, like feeling uncomfortable or being lethargic or having high levels of alertness, that these things shape the way that we become aware of our body and also what our body becomes aware of. And through the series of different mechanisms that are known in contemporary neuroscience and the pieces that are increasingly known as the science continues to progress and expand, we get to deeper and more rich understandings of what consciousness can be. So there's a lot more to be said than this, and as you can see, this book is several hundred pages and is one in a series of Damasio's works that's related to the work of other neuroscientists and other philosophers and people who also study this topic. I mention this book because I think it gives the most robust starting point for taking either a philosophical or a scientific approach to consciousness to see what the state of the science is. And this book was published more than 10 years ago and is now a standard entry point for a lot of researchers studying this field. So the layperson, the person of general interest in the study of consciousness and neuroscience, is not necessarily aware of this book, and that's why I'm offering this review today. So if you're interested in learning more about the philosophy and science of consciousness and how it relates to the advances and sophistication of contemporary neuroscience, then this is the book to get. I really highly recommend it, along with all of other works by Antonio Damasio. So there you go. Feel free to ask questions in the comment thread below, and let's have a discussion about this, or just pick it up and read it yourself, engage in your own inquiries, and learn more about how the mind emerges within an emergent process of physical bodies, and how this constrains the way that we design cultural change processes and our assumptions and philosophies about consciousness and the mind as we move forward. Enjoy.